Welcome back, babies. Hopefully you had a nice weekend, got outside and got a little vitamin D. I know there are several of you that are behind on our lessons. Please try not to get too far behind. If there is some reason you're not able to access the videos or access the material, please be sure you're letting me know by email, or we are going to start setting up Google Meetings. I realize if you don't have internet, that's really challenging, but please try to let me know why you're not able to keep up with our work. We do have a quiz on Thursday, so we've got this is our third lesson, and then we have a quiz. So, good news, what we're going to do today is significantly easier than quadratic formula. I personally don't love the quadratic formula, other than it always works. It's a little tedious. However, there are some special instances where we don't really need it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is quadratics that we can solve by taking a square root. So, we know that we can square root things. We've talked about that. We've done it in our calculator. But if you're looking at a quadratic equation, we can just use a square root to solve if we can get what's being squared all by itself. And what I mean, if you look at number 1 on our examples today, we've got x squared equals 81. So when I'm talking about what's being squared, this time x is being squared. So and that's what we're trying to solve. So if we can get x squared by itself on one side of the equal sign, then we can take the square root to get our solutions. And there will still be 2. And the reason, so when we square root both sides of this equation, because remember in algebra, we can do anything we want to an equation, as long as we do it to both sides and we don't divide by 0, then we can square root this 81. But you may notice I left a little space after my equal sign. And that's because we need the plus or minus symbol. And that's because there are 2 things that when I square them give me a positive 81. So the square root of x squared is just x. The square root of x squared is just x. And the square root of 81, if you type that in your calculator, is 9. But for our answer here, we have to consider that it's plus or minus 9. And what that means is it could be positive 9, but it could also be negative 9. Because positive 9 times positive 9 is positive 81, and negative 9 times negative 9 is also positive 81, because a negative times a negative is a positive. I personally will leave my solutions this way. This I know is 2 separate solutions. It's positive 9 or negative 9. If it makes you happy, you can separate them. If you'd rather write x equals 9, x equals negative 9, that's fine with me. I will leave them this way. And if you do this, that's fine also. So, an equation like number 1, it's obvious that what's being squared is by itself. That means I can take the square root. Life is great. Well, maybe not life is great, but the problem's easy. If you look at number 2, we don't have x squared by itself. It's not going to end up being a standard form of a quadratic. We're not going to get ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We certainly could move this negative 27 to the other side and get 0 on the right. However, since we don't have that linear term, we don't have a term with just an x, we might want to look and see if it's easier to take a square root. And in this problem, it is. So if we look at negative 3x squared equals negative 27, before you can square root anything, you need that variable squared all by itself. It is not all by itself on the left-hand side. So the first thing we need to do is divide both sides by negative 3. And then we get x squared equals, well, negative 27 divided by negative 3 is positive 9. And now we have x squared by itself. If we square root both sides, we get x equals, notice right away I put my plus or minus, because if I forget it, I'm going to be missing a solution. There are 2 solutions each time that you do this. So you need that plus or minus. One way I remember it is if I introduce a square root, I also have to introduce this plus or minus. Well, what's the square root of 9? 9's a perfect square, so it's going to be 3. So x in this particular equation would be plus or minus 3. Again, if you'd rather write it as x equals 3 and x equals negative 3, I'm totally fine with that. If you want to write it as plus or minus, that's also totally fine. And I didn't do this in number 1 because I think it was pretty straightforward, but just like any other equation that we've solved, you can always take these values and plug them back in and make sure that they work and make your equation true. Okay, so there's your intro, problems 1 and 2. I'm going to break it up for you so you don't have to watch the whole long video at once.